while back, after reading Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, the first book I've ever read by the author, I was eager to read more from her. It was a book unlike really any other I had read before. It was my first experience with dark academia. So when it came out that the sequel, Hellbent, would be releasing in January, it was instantly one of my most anticipated releases of the year. I recently finished reading Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo, second book in the Alex Stern saga. Me and my mustache have some thoughts. Now, if you haven't read Hellbent or Ninth House, or you don't know what this is about, none of this is going to make any sense to you at all. So I'm going to put a timestamp on the screen, and you can fast forward to that point if you don't want to hear the little synopsis set up for Ninth House. Ninth House is a novel that follows the unlikely Yale University freshman 20-year-old Alex, high school dropout and homicide survivor who can see ghosts, which are referred to in this universe as Greys. Alex is mysteriously offered a full ride to Yale University following her traumatic incident, despite her background and lack of qualifications. She attempts to navigate her new life at the Ivy League school while tasked by her benefactor with monitoring the 8 houses of the Veil, which are secret societies that harbor dark occult magic and power. Alex Stern, who is new to Yale University, is referred to as Dante in this Ninth House in Leafy House, and the other character, her sort of counterpart, Daniel Arlington, who is referred to as Darlington in this, is Virgil. Now, this comes from Dante's Inferno, which is part of the Divine Comedy, which explores a journey through hell. Within this 14th century Divine Comedy, we see Virgil guiding Dante literally through hell. In this series, it sort of explores that relationship between Virgil and Dante, where Virgil, which is Darlington, was sort of Alex Stern's guide in this new, terrifying, weird Ivy League university setting, which creates a really interesting dynamic between Alex and Darlington and paves the way for a lot of opportunity and parallel between this universe and what we see in Dante's Inferno. So at this point, I'm just going to give a general spoiler warning. I have a hard time talking about books I just read without spoiling pretty much anything. So if you haven't read Ninth House, you haven't read Hellbent, I would advise you to go do something else, maybe revisit this once you've read both books or Hellbent or whatever you want to do. Or watch on, that'd be great too. I'm going to recap and do this review by way of my annotation.
A literary man, you might say.
I don't always annotate my thoughts throughout a book, but I did this time, and I thought it would be interesting to sort of recap some of the notes I made, some of the exclamations I had at various parts throughout the book. The first thing that I noted is where we find Alex having her powers sort of throw a reverse Uno card at her, where in Ninth House we see that she is able to draw the power of the Greys that she sees around New Haven in order to increase her strength and get her through all of these different experiences, and instead she starts to feel some of these Greys, once she draws them in for her strength, take over her body and sort of possess her. Now, this could very well be foreshadowing of what is to come with the demonic possession down the road once they actually venture into hell, but I thought that was an interesting way to start this, given the fact that the last book, the way it ended, sort of established this promise that we'd be going straight to hell to go save Darlington. I was honestly a little disappointed that that's not the way it opened, because ever since I finished reading Ninth House, I sort of expected, not only based on the way that Ninth House ended, but also based on the title of the second book, Hellbent, that they would be hellbent to enter hell in the first place to go save Darlington. We have a murder mystery that's beginning to be set up. We have Detective Turner come back into the fold with Alex, and I like the dynamic between them, the relationship. Very rocky, very unpredictable, considering the ways that the 8 houses get involved with the New Haven community when things don't exactly go right with these secret magical societies. Through that beginning part, I was just sort of wondering what was going on with Darlington. He was sort of mentioned or referenced in passing here and there. Admittedly, Alex was like, yeah, I don't really know, like, still haven't gone to save him, and I was just pretty much waiting through that first third or so, quarter or so of the book for something to happen related to Darlington, because that is the conflict, the sort of issue from the first book that I wanted resolved the whole time. In knowing this parallel between the Divine Comedy with Dante's Inferno, this literal journey to hell, I was expecting some sort of parallel, the same thing to happen with Alex, and I was just kind of waiting and waiting and waiting, and obviously if you've read Hellbent and you're watching this, you know that it eventually happens. And eventually we see Darlington return in demonic form, and it's very interesting. There were some, appendages that were glowing, and I thought this book was going down a very different road. Immediately some interesting elements are thrown into the fold with the different riddles, the games that we learn that demons like to play within the mortal realm. And I constantly found myself very distrustful of what characters were saying and very paranoid that someone was being influenced by something that had come from the other side, because clearly Darlington wasn't his former self. Eventually, he fulfills his role, right? Darlington does a lot in the second half of the book, but when he first returns, I just kind of found his return to New Haven and to the mortal realm kind of anticlimactic. And I get it, he was only kind of there, he was contained within the circle, and again, we learned that there were some things happening behind the scenes related to Darlington, but really I just wanted to see things happening with Darlington and Alex. That's the promise that we are made, considering what happens within Ninth House. And then we see this very heist-like setup begin to unfold, where everybody's sort of getting the Lethe gang together with Turner, eventually with Trip, with Dawes, with Alex, and then Mercy, who is completely outside of this like magical realm at Yale. It just seems like she is way too easily brought into the fold. It feels like, based on who we got to know Dawes as in the first book, she didn't resist it all that much. It was like a quick little questioning of the decision making, and whether we like it or not, Mercy is brought into this group to play a role. And the next thing I wrote down was the vampire scene, with many question marks and exclamation points, some expletives. It turned me off, honestly. I was like, this is turning into this kind of book. Right now, we're going to include vampires in this book. My life flashed before my eyes. I thought this was all of a sudden going to turn into like an early 2000s flashback to a vampire YA novel. I was very disappointed in the moment that the word vampire was even uttered in this book. While yes, there are these secret magical orders within this universe, I guess the door is open to anything being possible, but just the mention of the word vampire made me cringe and made me just have to like pause for a second and be like, just prepare yourself for what kind of book this might potentially turn into here, and it may not be to my very liking. This ends up being justified through some different sort of principles around the way that like demons operate in the mortal realm down the road. It was organic in its inclusion. And finally, a ways into the book, we get the descent. Now, when I considered the possibility that they would be traveling to like literally hell, I was kind of worried, because the thought of creating a fictional world where you have a group of characters in this already pretty big universe that has tons of possibilities within these secret magical orders traveling to hell, the scope of that is huge and tough to tackle. But I thought Bardugo did a great job of it, of sort of bringing the scope in, and instead of making maybe like a traditional image of hell that we might think of in our mind, it's more like the upside down from Stranger Things. That's sort of the way I pictured it, because all of a sudden the characters find themselves in some sort of alternate old-timey New Haven, and they eventually find Darlington there, sort of resigned to a purgatory-like state where he is just stacking stone after stone on a building. And I thought that was probably a wise decision in Bardugo's process of traveling to this location that had the potential to just shut down the whole entire book. And it was a perfectly executed opportunity to elaborate more on these characters' backstories, where in order to gain entrance into hell, each of these characters are sort of paying witness to each other's transgressions that allowed them to team up as like, I guess, the pseudo murder squad that they needed to be in order to get there in the first place. I knew that they weren't going to truly rescue him. It wrote down, LOL, never mind, they're bouncing out of there again, because of course they couldn't rescue him the first time. And then from then on, upon their return to New Haven, establishing a better plan to actually rescue Darlington this time, all the sort of loops are closed. All the explanations are made in terms of who writer, whatever his name is, the guy who the vampire is. He is one of the former students who accessed this gauntlet and went to hell in the first place. We eventually learn why this gauntlet is there in the first place. We learn who Anselm is and how he's being possessed by a demon, and sort of orchestrating this whole entire murder mystery that's going on, eventually sort of tying Alex's past traumas, her life from California, back into the fold. She tricked somebody who's chasing her the whole entire book into sort of swapping places in hell. We rescue Darlington, and everybody returns back to New Haven. There was this sort of like wolf ritual once Alex reassumed her duties as the new Virgil that I thought, again, with the whole vampire inclusion, was being set up as like a Twilight remake. I was so incredibly worried during this book that that's where all of this was going as soon as there was some sort of like werewolf related implications. But luckily that whole part was sort of glanced over, and we got a pretty great ending considering all things. Still sort of jarring in some of the revelations, especially with Tripp's state as he's like a vampire at the end, and they're totally cool with it even though he's fully possessed by a demon, but his soul sort of transferred into this vampire's body. A lot of chaos. This book was chaotic. If I was to sum it up, so some things that I liked about this book. First of all, I love Alex Stern's character. I love that she is flawed. She is self-admittedly flawed, and she uses a lot of that in painting the picture of where she's at, where she's trying to go, the way that she operates in terms of her relationships with others, the way she feels at home or doesn't feel at home in places. I like that it's not this perfect character who enters into this magical world and everything is just like butterflies and rainbows. This is a dark, gritty character who is full of imperfections, and it just makes it a whole lot more believable and a lot more engaging in my opinion. The whole setting of Yale University in New Haven creates this extremely surreal aspect where magical orders and the society itself and all these secrets, the border between that and the real world is so thin. It's such a sort of blurred line that it makes this all so engaging and so believable. And I think the character arcs and the development is great, sort of using those flashbacks within their journey to hell to sort of reveal sort of why Tripp is the way he is, why Turner is the way he is. That was one of the most interesting parts of this book. It just does a lot in terms of character development, and flashbacks can often be a pretty big crutch when it comes to character development and sort of avoiding progressing the characters in the present time, but I thought it was masterfully done here. And the found family theme I think is really great. It does a lot establishing the message that despite traumatic background, despite all these terrible things that have happened in pretty much all of these characters' lives, whatever they experienced in their past isn't their only chance. They sort of find each other and they really don't like each other at first. Like Dawes and Alex don't have a good relationship at first. Darlington and Alex don't have a great relationship at first. Turner and Alex certainly don't. There's skepticism and conflict and butting heads at the beginning of all of these relationships. They have each other, and it's just this interesting group of people who come together despite very broken and traumatic backgrounds. I don't really have a ton of dislikes with this book. I thought it was a really, really solid sequel. The whole vampire thing threw me off for a while. It was very jarring. It ended up not being that big of a deal, but that's just me being nitpicky. I felt that a lot of the big promises, the huge anticipations, just sort of were anticlimactic in the way that they were resolved. Definitely in Darlington returning, you don't even really see it happen. They just kind of go back to the house and he happens to be there within this circle. Despite my reluctance with this whole wolf ritual thing, I thought it would be cool to experience that, as there was some like real estate in some chapters leading up to Alex's attendance with this ritual, and it just sort of started at the very end of a chapter and it picked up as it being over with. So I thought some of the payoffs were kind of anticlimactic. Those were with sort of nitpicky points in the books. But overall, I really liked Hellbent, and I thought Ninth House was a great first book, Hellbent a great follow-up, and clearly it's being staged to possibly pick up right where they left off in Hellbent, and I'm interested to see how this continues. I'm also kind of reluctant to read other Leigh Bardugo works, as this was the first time I've read Leigh Bardugo books, and these are very clearly positioned as like adult books, or some would call them like new adult book. It seems like all of her other books with The Six of Crows and the Shadow and Bone trilogy are very much so YA, so I don't know how I'm gonna receive that compared to like the very dark, gritty nature of Ninth House and Hellbent. But I guess we'll see, as they are some books that I definitely want to read this year. So let me know down in the comments if you have read Ninth House or Hellbent. I'd love to have a discussion down there and catch up with you. Other than that, that's everything I have. So until next.